Greetings and welcome. I'm Jack and this is a beginner's Pathfinder 2nd edition character build. In this video, what I'm going to try to do is to learn a new class from Pathfinder 2nd edition by theory crafting a character from level 1 to level 20. Today we are dealing with the Cleric. So what we are going to do, as always, is to start with a brief class overview, proceed with the character concept that this class inspired, and then detail the character progression from level 1 to level 20. At the end, I am going to present also a spell snapshot at particular levels to give the idea of the character progression as they level up. You could make the argument for the Cleric that a damage projection would also be relevant. However, I will explain in the character concept section of the video why for this character I don't think damage is going to be very relevant. Last thing before we begin, I would like to thank the Gentleman's Guide to Faith, the Pathfinder 2nd edition Cleric Guide, and RPG Bot's Cleric Handbook for helping me learning the class, as well as Gortle's Spell Guide to help me navigate the divine spell selection. This is all for the introduction, so let's get straight into the class overview. The Cleric is a divine spellcaster, which usually also mixes in some level of martial competence. Unlike arcane spellcasters, it is a spellcaster that derives their powers from a certain deity which they worship, and since there is a wide variety of gods with different precepts and beliefs, there is also a wide variety of clerics with different skills that match their beliefs. The Cleric has proven throughout history to be a bit of a tricky class to balance. In particular, in the 3.5 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, they were quite overpowered. It was very easy even for a new player to turn a Cleric into a character that could easily overshadow martials while still being a full spellcaster. 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons manages to rein in, I think, the overpoweredness of Clerics. I think they are in a very good spot in that system. They are quite balanced, with some notable exceptions. But enough talking about D&D, we're here for Pathfinder. And Pathfinder is a heir to the 3.5 D&D system. So let's see how they dealt with the Cleric nonsense. I think they did it pretty well. So we see that some characteristic features of the Cleric are their reasonably high HP for a spellcaster. However, when it comes to their martial prowess and proficiency with weapons and armor, these are all locked behind a class feature, which is the doctrine. There are two doctrines. These are subclasses that the Cleric chooses at level 1. The Cloistered Cleric is the cloth caster, as the name implies. Its characteristic is that they gain full spellcasting proficiency up to legendary at 19th level. The alternative to the Cloistered Cleric is the War Priest. The War Priest trades this spellcasting proficiency, which is a very hefty price to pay, and in return what it gets is better saving throw, progression, and training in armor and in martial weapons. These trainings do not equal that of martials, but they are still way better than the absolute nothing that the Cloistered Cleric gets. It seems that the Cleric asks of you to make a decision right at the start. Are you going to be a Gish, or are you going to be a full spellcaster? The other important decision for a Cleric, of course, is the selection of the deity. This ends up determining their alignment, the domains they have access to, and most importantly, their Divine Font feature. The Divine Font is basically access to extra spells, and depending on whether the god is good or evil, this spell can be harm or heal. Some deities are flexible on that point and allow the Cleric to choose between the two. Of course, just like with the champion, deities tie their followers to anathemas, so they have to follow the core precepts of the deity, and if they go against these precepts, they will suffer heavy penalties. They will lose their class abilities and magical abilities until they perform the Atone ritual. I'm not going to bitch for half an hour about anathemas, not just because I just did it with the last video, but because I think this is not as offensive to me as Champion's Anathema, simply by virtue of the fact that there are really a lot, and I mean it, a lot of different deities with a lot of different beliefs that really, I don't think it's even possible to come up with a character concept that doesn't meet any god in the huge range of options that Pathfinder gives you. In fact, this offering is so huge that it might be a bit daunting for new players to figure out what gods to follow and what domains to choose. However, I do not think that this choice should be paralyzing, mostly because while the choice of deity and of domains are certainly impactful for the character, and in particular, cloistered clerics and war clerics are going to look for different things. For example, the choice of deity spells are going to matter more probably for a cloistered cleric, while a war cleric will care more about the god's weapon. But despite this, domains and the choice of god do not seem to matter as much as they do in 5th edition, in the sense that they are not the actual subclasses. So they offer some benefits, but they do not completely turn the character over the head. So even if you choose a different god, your character will not play necessarily that much differently. Domain spells, while spammable, do not quite compete with leveled spells. They are a bit in between cantrips and leveled spells. Your most powerful effects are usually going to be your leveled spells and not your domain spells. And the same is true for the spells your deity grants you, which are outside the divine spell list sometimes, but they are usually very few. There are only 3 in most cases, although there are some gods like Nethys, the god of magic, which give you a lot more spells to be known. However, what really gives the cleric his identity, it's probably the choice in doctrine rather than the choice in domain. As I already mentioned, clerics are divine spellcasters, so they cast from the divine spell list. This is the smallest of all the spell lists. It is complemented by the spell your god grants you, but these spells are not that many. It is a spell list which is very focused on buffs, and I have looked at the occult spell list, and in comparison, the divine spell list just has a lot of holes, a lot of things that it cannot do. So it seems that the cleric, especially if they are a dedicated spellcaster, really wants to get as much as possible from their deity and gaining access to different options, for example, for damage. But the divine spell list still features a bunch of very good buff and support spells, and in particular, it features the best healing spell in the game, which is Heal. And the cleric, as a class, seems to be very focused on this spell. Their main feature revolves around giving you more of these heal spells. And this is where the power of the cleric, I think, comes from when compared to other spellcasters. Of course, if you choose a negative divine font, then you gain access to harm. While it is the symmetrical version of heal, it deals damage instead of healing it. It seems mechanically worse because the damage it deals isn't nearly comparable to the damage that can be dished out by a martial, resource free, while this costs a hefty resource price. And yes, while you can go next to an enemy and spam single action harms and do a lot of damage by doing that, you're going to run out of spell slots very quickly, and then you're going to probably be useless. So I don't know how viable of a strategy that is. Whereas death seems a more likely threat in the Pathfinder system than it is in 5th edition. So being able to mitigate that, being able to keep your companions on their feet and prevent them from being knocked out and then having to waste their actions standing back up, maybe recovering the weapon that they dropped while losing consciousness, that spell seems like an invaluable asset. I mentioned that it seems like the cleric is very focused on the heal spell, and this is because many of the class feats enhance or modify the way the heal spell works. However, and this comes from a 5th edition player, I am very hesitant to take those feats because dedicated healers are notoriously questionable in 5th edition. And I don't know about that in Pathfinder 2nd edition, but it seems to me as if the heal spell, just having access to it and having access to more versions of it is sufficient to play a pretty serviceable healer. The benefits you get from class feats are negligible when compared to just the fact that you have that spell and you can cast it more often than anyone. That is such a powerful asset on its own that it doesn't feel it needs much more support from feats. This can also be accompanied by a proficiency in medicine, which is well supported by your primary class stat, which is wisdom. So these two things together make you a very competent healer. If you start, however, neglecting healing feats in the cleric selection, you will quickly find out that their offering of class feats is, like the champions, kind of disappointing when compared to classes like the Barbarian or the Bard. I wonder if this is done to keep the Cleric in check, if this is a consequence of how powerful and oppressive clerics were in previous edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and so if this is an attempt to keep the cleric in check by not giving them too much powerful stuff, unlike what the other classes get. I think that this decision makes archetypes very appealing for clerics. Of course, I am making builds with the free archetype rule, so I'm going to be spoiled for choice, but even a character which is being built without this optional rule, I think would be very well served by looking elsewhere and not just within their class for feats. Another thing to note is that the Cleric is a very mad multiple attribute dependent class, even more so than the Champion. It wants strength if you want to be martial-like and deal damage, unless you're going for a range build, of course. It wants dexterity for a bit of survivability. You do not get heavy armor, so you need a bit of dexterity. And for reflex saving throws. It certainly wants constitution, because being dead is bad. Wisdom is your primary spellcasting ability, so you want that. Charisma fuels your divine font, so it gives you more of your probably best spell. And intelligence is the only stat you can really dump carefree. Basically, you want everything but intelligence. And even in a system which is very generous with your ability score increase, like Pathfinder, you are going to be stretched pretty thin, and you're going to be making some tough choices. The last thing I want to say about the Cleric is that I think it is a deceptively simple class. That is to say, in its simplicity, it looks very straightforward. It screams healer. It asks you a very simple question at the beginning. Do you want to be a fightery character, or do you want to be a more spellcastery character? But in all this simplicity, it actually asks some very tough choices from the player during character development. And while the strengths and the core themes of the class are obvious, the direction in which to grow the character and the choices to make throughout character development are not at all obvious and are actually quite tough. I think this will become more clear as we move on to the next section of the video and I present the concept of the character that I'm going to try to build. Now, I want to be very honest about this. The Cleric is the character that I had the most trouble making a build for thus far. And this is because, as I said before, the Cleric is a class that asks you to make a lot of choices during the character building. And all of these choices have drawbacks. There are so many different things you want as a Cleric, and it seems like you can never get all of them, at least not at the same times. This all revolves around the two doctrines. Let's start from the War Priest, which is the Gish-like character, which is probably the most appealing one because it offers right from the get-go better defenses, which looks great, and then it also gives you the possibility to attack with weapons. As a Cleric, you have this issue of dealing damage and maybe using your third action, so a martial strike seems like a very reasonable offering. The War Priest, however, has to forego their spellcasting proficiency to gain these options, and that is an extremely heavy price to pay for a primary spellcaster. What's more, being a War Priest doesn't make you even close to a martial. You are still late to the party when it comes to weapon proficiency. Your defenses are still not up to standard to the martials. Just look at your hit points. They are 8 and not 10, so you are way squishier than a true martial. And you're also going to have to fight against the fact that your class does not allow you to take either strength or dexterity, so you're always going to be one ability score behind martials, and perhaps even more, depending on all the other stats that you want to prioritize as a martial cleric. But of all these issues, the worst one is actually that as you level up, the other cleric, the cloistered cleric, will be able to take feats, and this is because their class feats are not necessarily that good, so it's very easy for a cleric to take archetypes, and through those archetypes, and maybe even general feats, they are going to eventually be able to gain everything that you got at the start. So they will gain your weapon proficiency, they will gain your armor proficiency, they will be just as martial-like as you, but still retain the full spellcasting proficiency. So it seems like a very bad deal. However, where the War Priest really shines is at low levels, because they get all these benefits, the armor proficiency, they can use reasonable weapons to strike. They are not that far behind martials in terms of accuracy and damage potential. Whereas the Cloistered Cleric is just naked, completely naked, and they don't know how to deal damage, and maybe they don't know what to do in combat because they have few spell slots and many actions and no way to obviously fill their turn. So if you were to play only at low level, I think War Priest would be the obviously better choice. While if you were to play only at the mid to high level, I think the best choice once again is obviously the Cloistered Cleric. However, we are making a build from level 1 to level 20, and we want to see the progression of the character, and this is where the trouble of the build comes from. What do you want to sacrifice? What do you want to renounce? And what choices are you going to make during your path? So for this build, I don't really have a strong character concept as it was for the Bard of the Barbarian. Rather, I want to experiment a bit with the class rules. So what I want to do is I want to make a Cloistered Cleric, and I want to see exactly how long it takes me to get to the level of a War Priest and when we become better than War Priest. How bad is our survivability? What are we going to do in our first few levels when we are at the weakest? And how powerful do we get at the end of our build? Despite this being an experiment in kind of competing with the War Priest, I want to rival the War Priest when it comes to its defensive potential, which I think is its most powerful asset. The offensive potential, which is the use of weapons, is something I am still skeptical towards. You can certainly play very satisfactory clerics that use weapons. However, the fact that you need to move to the enemy, use an action to strike them, eventually means that you're going to have trouble casting your 2 actions spells. So since we are going to be very spellcasting focused, I don't think using a weapon is necessarily something we want to do. So instead, I'm going to use other archetypes to gain alternative actions to carry out in combat rather than spellcasting. In particular, I find the martial class to be very interesting for a cleric. The martial class is a class that basically trades their action and gives them to the other party members. I think it's the ultimate support class, and I think it's great for a cleric because I would much rather give extra actions to people like the fighter rather than having me try to emulate the fighter and be a bit worse than them. So we're still going to be in the thick of battle. We're still going to deal melee damage, but indirectly through the martial and through supporting our companions and giving them extra actions instead of wielding weapons ourselves. The big question of this build is mainly around the first levels. How squishy are we going to be? How much are we going to fall behind the War Priest? And in particular, since we are aiming to become martials, how much are we getting screwed over by being Cloistered Clerics? Because martials need training in martial weapons, and we do not have that as Cloistered Clerics. We would gain it at level 3 as War Clerics. So let's see how we can make this all work in the character build. Right off the bat, the first thing we need to accomplish with this character is try to get as many feats as possible to compensate for the fact that we are not War Clerics. Human is a perfect ancestry for that because it has a lot of feat support. For our background, I'm going to take a slightly questionable choice and choose Farmhand. I will explain this better later on. We are, of course, a cleric. And at level 1, the most complicated thing to decide is the allocation of the ability scores. Wisdom is our primary stat, so we are going to invest heavily on that. We also want a bit of charisma. It's very important for cleric, and we'll use our ancestry boost for that. And we will also want strength for our archetype later on, as we will see. So this means that by putting our free boosts in Strength, Constitution, Wisdom, and again Charisma, we start with a pretty nice spread of stats. What we are sacrificing here is Dexterity and Constitution, which means that our low levels are alarmingly vulnerable. When compared to a War Cleric, we are squishy, we are pretty useless, we have no offensive options, basically. It's obvious that the best choice for us would be to actually start as a War Cleric and retrain out of it later on. Another important choice is a deity. There are really a lot of deities. I chose Serenre because I know who she is and because she provides very good spells, in particular Fireball, and a lot of useful domain spells. As I said, we are cloistered clerics, and we might as well choose one of the domains for Serenre. The Truth domain has a very nice domain ability, as does the Fire domain if you want an attack focus spell. However, I am going to choose the Sun domain. This is going to give me access to a pretty nice focus spell, which we can use every combat. And this spell basically dazzles on a success creatures in a 15-foot cone. Dazzle is a very nice combat debuff. It makes everyone obscured, meaning that the creature has to pass a DC 5 flat check to be able to target them. And it also makes it possible to everyone to hide from the dazzled creature. Our font, of course, is healing. And the favorite weapon of Serenre is the scimitar, but we're not really going to use it. In fact, if you really wanted to use a weapon, which might not be a terrible idea at this level, the gauntlet, I think, is the better option. This leaves you with a free hand, and it allows you to do all actions that require free hands. Using Battle Medicine is one of those. We do not have it yet, but we will have it soon enough. Another thing that we really want at this level is a shield. It's not going to save us, we've got terrible armor class, but raising a shield later on will become a pretty good option for us, so we want to start with the shield. Also, Serenre make us trained in medicine. This is the reason why I did not take Field Medic. I am not sure whether or not the skill training granted you by your deity can be retrained if it corresponds to your background choice. I think it is. And if it is, then Field Medic is an excellent starting choice for a background because it allows you to do Battle Medicine from level 1. If it isn't, we are going to use and need Assurance in Athletics. For our heritage, we are going to choose Versatile Heritage. This allows us to get one of those general feats which we desperately need. At this level, we could take a general feat like Toughness or Improved Initiative. What we eventually want to get, right now it's doing nothing, so we would have to retrain this at level 3 when it becomes relevant, is Adopted Ancestry. For the Dwarf Ancestry, we are going to really need low-level Dwarf feats to wear heavy armor and compensate for the penalties for wearing armor. I do like taking Adopted Ancestry Dwarf a lot. It has a very... Dwarf has a lot of very cool ancestry feats. The problem is that starting as a dwarf means having 5 less movement speed, and I really don't like it. So I just steal the feats using Adopted Ancestry. Lastly, we get our actual ancestry feat. And for this, I think Adapted Cantrip is very useful to provide us a pretty reliable damage dealing option. This allows us to basically replace one of our Divine Cantrip with a cantrip which we can then use with Wisdom. And this can be an offensive attack cantrip like Electric Arc. And it means we can have a spammable activity we can do in combat from reasonably far away. We only know 2 skills. It's a consequence of having low intelligence, and our class doesn't really provide many. Since we have Charisma, we might as well take some social skills like Diplomacy and Intimidation. I am planning to take both of these to Legendary because I like these feats. In particular, I chose Diplomacy because of a feat we'll see later on, which is called Evangelize. But if you want, you can really pick any other skill which has Wisdom or an ability score which we are using, maybe even Athletics. So this is our level 1. We are extremely squishy, but not completely useless. And in particular, our Divine Font is giving us an amazing amount of spells, in particular healing spells, and we are unrivaled when compared to other spellcasters. Of course, if we were War Clerics, we would also be a lot more survivable and perhaps able to deal some more damage using weapons. Right now, what we want to do is to stay as far away from combat as possible and support our allies from a distance. But this is going to change as we level up. At level 2, what we get is a class feat. I'm going to take Rapid Response. This is a very good reaction. We have no reaction, and it allows us to stride immediately when an ally is reduced to 0 hit points, with a plus 10 foot circumstance bonus to our speed. This enables us next turn to use our healing abilities, and also a skill feat, which I was mentioning, which is very important for any medicine user, which is Battle Medicine. This allows us to use, as an action, medicine in combat to heal. Since we are wisdom characters, and since medicine is such a powerful skill, we are going to invest in it, and we're going to be a healer both through magic and conventional means. We also get our free archetype, and once again, I'm going to choose the Champion Dedication, which is why I took 14 strength at character creation. This increases our survivability immensely because it allows us to wear medium armor and even heavy armor. Of course, we do not meet the strength requirement for that, but medium armor is already a big increase in our survivability. We have to choose an archetype, which means we will be bound to Anathema. A Redeemer seems reasonable enough. Eventually, I will take the Redeemer's Reaction, which I think is the best one offered here. But you can be a Paladin of Serenre or a Liberator of Serenre if you want. We are already trained in the deity's skills and religions, so we effectively get 2 free skills. We can take Acrobatics, which can be convenient to have sometimes, although our dexterity is terrible. And for this skill, really pick your favorite. I'm going to pick Survival, but you could pick Nature. I like these skills because we already have an innately high wisdom. I think Survival might come in handy more often than Nature, but this is very campaign dependent. At level 3, we get our first skill increase. I think it's important to keep up with medicine, since we are medics. We also get our second Doctrine, increasing our proficiency rank for Fortitude saves to Expert, which is nice. We also get a General feat, and for the General feat, we are going to be taking Ancestral Paragon, which allows us to take instead a first level ancestry feat. And the feat we're going to take is the reason why we adopted Dwarf as our ancestry, and it is Unburdened Iron. This means that we can ignore the reduction to our speed from any armor we wear. This means that if we were to wear heavy armor right now, despite us not meeting the strength requirement, we would not be slowed. So we can actually wear full plate at level 3. The issue is that we still take the armor penalty to all strength and dexterity skill checks that are not attack actions. This is the reason why I took Assurance in Athletics, so that at least one of these skills could be used somewhat decently, and we wouldn't just be rendered completely useless by something like jumping or stairs. Of course, we are going to increase our strength to eventually reach up to 18 and be able to wear full plate without all these penalties. But with Unburdened Iron and Assurance in Athletics, we kind of mitigate the worst of wearing heavy armor without meeting the strength requirements, and I think we can try and do this from this level onwards. When we eventually reach 18 in strength, I'm still going to keep Unburdened Iron because it's still going to provide us +5 speed, but if you wanted to, you could then retrain it for something else. At level 4, I couldn't find any class feats for the Cleric that were particularly exciting, so instead I went for the old reliable Healing Touch. Gaining Lay on Hands as Cleric really enhances our abilities as a healer, as the party healer, and we can also take Basic Devotion or Desperate Prayer, which gives us an extra focus point. We also get a skill feat, and the reason why we increased the medicine is so we could gain access to Ward Medic as soon as possible. This means we can treat diseases or wounds targeting up to 2 targets instead of 1 in our off time, and this is going to increase as our mastery, as our proficiency in medicine increases. This feels like an essential feat that you need to get if you want to be a medic and if you want to invest in medicine. At level 5, we get a skill increase, and we can increase Intimidation, and we get our ability boosts. Now for our ability boosts, we are going to follow the abilities we took at level 1, and we're going to therefore take Strength, Constitution, Wisdom, and Charisma. We also get an Ancestry feat, and for this Ancestry feat, once again, Human comes in clutch, because it allows us to take General Training. This is not essential at this level. It will be at next level. So if you want to take another ancestry feat, for example, Natural Ambition for more domain spells, then you can surely take this and then retrain it. But I'm going to take General Training right now in order to get Weapon Proficiency. This gives us Martial Weapon Proficiency, just like a War Cleric, because we are already trained in simple weapons. We need this as a requirement for the archetype which we are going to take next level, which is the Martial archetype. A War Cleric might have been able to take this as early as level 4, but not earlier because their Martial Weapon Proficiency only starts at level 3. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. First of all, at level 6 we get a class feat, and this is one of the very interesting class feats for clerics, and it is called Cast Down. It is a meta magic action which modifies your heal or harm spell. If the next action you use is to cast one of these spells and these spells damage one creature, heal can damage creatures if they have negative healing, then if that creature takes any damage from the spell, and I will remind you that creatures take damage even if they succeed the saving throw. To take no damage at all, they would have to critically succeed on their saving throws. And our spell DC is pretty good because we are cloistered clerics. So this is an effect which is pretty likely to occur. And this effect is that the target is knocked prone. If it critically fails, it also takes a -10 status foot penalty to its speed for 1 minute. This makes it so harm becomes a very powerful control spell. We are going to see in the spell snapshot how taking this feat impacts our spell selection, but it gives us, I think, a very nice amount of control, and it makes our low-level spell slots very useful. For the free archetype, as I was anticipating, we are going to be taking the Martial Dedication. Right now, this means we are surrounded by a 10-foot aura, which gives +1 status bonus to saving throw against fear. It also means we can choose a skill between Diplomacy and Intimidation. We're going to choose Diplomacy, because we already have Intimidation, and gain Expert Proficiency in that skill. We also get a skill feat, and we might as well be getting Intimidating Prowess. We meet its strength requirement, and this allows us to intimidate more reliably, and also to get a little bonus to our intimidation, to our demoralized checks. At level 7, we get another skill increase. This is our first master skill increase. This should be a medicine skill increase, but as you should know by now, I am a sucker for intimidation. I always take it whenever I get the chance. This is a character who is investing in charisma. I have yet to make a build which does not invest in charisma, and so I have yet to make a build which will not take intimidation and prioritize its feats every time possible. This is very debatable, especially for a skill which is as powerful as medicine. And this is, I think, the instance where it makes the most sense to just disregard intimidation and just keep focusing on medicine. However, I just love the free action, so I'm not going to do that. We also get a general feat, and I will take Incredible Initiative. As always, a bonus to initiative rolls seems nice. Our third doctrine means that we gain increased proficiency for our divine spells. At level 8, we get a class feat. Here I took Advanced Domain. This gives us the second domain spell for the Sun domain. This is an incredibly cool spell which is called Positive Luminance. It is the reason why I chose the Sun domain over the Fire domain, which would have given a more immediate effect. Perhaps more powerful than Dazzling Flash, certainly easier to use and to spam. But Positive Luminance is something that we might want to use every combat, and it's a very long and complicated spell, but what it does is it makes you glow, and it gives you a resource, a unique resource, which is called a Luminance Reservoir. And this reservoir keeps growing as the turns pass by. You have to use a free action every turn to increase the radius of the light and to increase the points you've got in your reservoir. At any point, you can dismiss the spell, and you can channel this light and positive energy either to heal a living target or to damage an undead target. I don't know if this is incredibly powerful, but I do know this is incredibly cool, and it fits so well with our theme of a warrior of light, which inspires their allies. We are pretty good against undead. Just heal makes us good against undead, but this is just an added benefit. I would probably do this every fight just to have access to this cheap heal which we can just spam, but maybe saving Lay on Hands is better. For our free archetype, I will take the first stance of the martial class, and I will take Dread Martial Stance. This increases the damage of our ally. It is kind of a rare effect. I haven't found many spells and effects that do that grant a status bonus to damage rolls, that is. Inspiring Martial Stance might be better because it grants a status bonus to the attack rolls. However, this status bonus seems easier to acquire, for example, if you have a Bard. So if you already have that bonus, I'm assuming you probably do, then Dread Martial Stance is better. If you don't, then you can go for the Inspiring Martial Stance. For the skill feats, the reason why I took the Master Proficiency in Intimidation is Battle Cry, free action at the start of combat to demoralize. At level 9, another skill increase, and now for sure we're going to bring up our medicine. Actually, we won't. I will take Master Proficiency in Diplomacy. This is, I'm pretty sure, a suboptimal choice, but there is a cool skill feat that I want to take for Diplomacy next level, so I chose Diplomacy here. Our Ancestry feat will be another very good Dwarf feat, which is Mountain Stoutness. This gives us extra HP and makes it less punishing for us to be staying in the middle of the fray, which is something that we want to do right now because we are marshals. So we don't necessarily want to be in the face of the enemy, but we do want to be very close to our martial characters, to our strikers, to buff them with our martial stance. At level 10, we get more ability boosts, and we boost the same abilities as before: Strength, Constitution, Wisdom, and Charisma. We also get a class feat, and here I took Channel Succor. This basically means that we can use our heal spells for a number of versatile effects, which are circumstantial, but they are certainly very useful. Spells like Remove Curse, Remove Disease, Remove Paralysis, the kind of spell that you would not want to prepare because you're probably not going to cast it, but this means that you never have it if you think like that, and so when you do need it, you are going to really regret not having prepared it. So now we don't have to face that conundrum. We can just use a heal spell to emulate the effect of these spells. We also get a free archetype feat. We're going to take more martial feats, and we're going to take what I feel like is the iconic martial feat, which is Cadence Call. We can use one action to transfer this action to an ally. This extra action can only be used to stride, and if the ally does that, then they become slowed 1 until the end of their following turn. This can be used to anticipate the movement of an ally, maybe get them out of a dangerous AoE effect, help them in a blitz turn get into the face of the enemy. It is an effect which has a drawback, but this is an AoE effect, so it effectively trades one action for multiple other actions for the party. Then we get the skill feat I was talking about, and the reason why I took Diplomacy. This feels like it should be a religious feat, a feat associated to the religion skill. Instead, it is associated to Diplomacy. It is kind of like Bon Mot, but it applies the stupefied condition. It is a debuff to mental ability checks, including will saving throws, based on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. This includes spell attack rolls and spell DCs, and so it's a very nice action to use on a spellcaster, especially because a stupefied spellcaster, whenever they attempt to cast a spell, they are disrupted unless they succeed a flat check, which equals a DC of 5 plus the stupefied value, which is in this case, usually stupefied 1, unless we critically succeed and it's stupefied 2. At level 11, we get our skill increase, which should be medicine. Finally, we get it to master proficiency where it deserves to be. We also get a general feat, and I think toughness is a very safe bet. We are not exactly frontliners, but we are in the midst of battle pretty often, so extra HP cannot hurt. Our fourth doctrine increases our proficiency with our deity weapons and general weapons. It's not very relevant for us. We're not doing weapon attacks with this build. We also get increased reflex saving throws. At level 12, we get another powerful cleric feat, which is Domain Focus. This allows us to recover 2 focus points when refocusing instead of 1. It means we can use more freely our Positive Luminance and our Lay on Hands. Maybe even our Dazzling Flash. Keep in mind that at this point we actually have 3 focus points because of all the focus spells we took. We also get a free archetype feat. I chose back to back because it's a very nice passive feat which makes it harder for you and your allies to be flanked. This increases your defenses and your survivability as well as your allies. For our skill feat, we will take a very important medicine skill, which is Advanced First Aid. This modifies our Administer First Aid activity, which we could previously use to stabilize or stop bleeding of a creature. Now we can also use it to mitigate the frightened or sickened condition. The sickened condition in particular is very nasty to get rid of. So this makes our medicine skill, and in particular the Administer First Aid action, more flexible and more powerful. This is a feat you probably wanted a couple of levels earlier, but I didn't take it then because I'm a moron and I like to scream litanies and anthems at my enemies rather than helping my party perform better. But you shouldn't do that. You should definitely take these feats in the opposite order. At level 13, we get another skill increase. We have already 3 expert skill proficiencies because of the martial archetype. So we could get an expert proficiency if we wanted, or we could get an additional training, and I will take nature so that we have all of the wisdom abilities covered. Deception feels like something our character wouldn't do very much, so I will leave it at untrained. We get an ancestry feat, and once again I'll take advantage of the human feat support and take general training. This will allow me to get a general feat to support my survivability, and that feat is Die Hard, to try and avoid dying as much as possible. We get Divine Defense. We would have liked to be getting this a bit sooner. We are in heavy armor and pretty happy with it, so this doesn't do much for us. We also get Weapon Specialization, which, once again, doesn't do much for us. At level 14, it's a good moment to get our Champion reaction. We could have gotten this sooner, but unlike a champion who is very tanky and wants the enemies to attack him instead of the party, we are not nearly as survivable as a champion. So taking a reaction sooner, I felt, would have been a bit suicidal. But the Redeemer reaction is very powerful, and is in fact one of the things I was regretting the most, not being able to feature in my previous video when I covered the champion. So we're going to get it here, and we're going to punish our foes for attacking our allies. The foe will have to choose whenever they attack an ally and we use this reaction, either to forego completely, entirely, the damage that triggered our reaction, or to become enfeebled to, and also give our ally resistance to all damage equal to 2 plus our level. Unfortunately, I didn't feel safe in taking this sooner because I feared we were a bit too fragile. Another thing we get at level 14, this is not from the champion archetype, but it's from the martial archetype. And level 14 is really a big level for us. And it's this ability called Tactical Cadence. This upgrades our cadence core so that the allies that are affected by it are no longer slowed the following turn if they use the extra action. Furthermore, they can also use the extra action not just to stride, but also to strike. In a party with a lot of martials, this is great. A third action strike, as always, subject to multiple attack penalties, so it's not as incredible as a 5th edition haste effect, but we are turning through this feat a single action to a number of action equal to our party members. This is an action economy cheat in a game which revolves around a very strict 3-action system, and there is no way this ability isn't incredible and busted. Dare I say that we might even rival bards with our support capabilities. I don't know if a bard would want to take a martial archetype because they have a lot of very cool class feats, but we don't, so we can surely take this archetype. And also we don't have many single actions like the bard does to keep our turn busy. It's probably going to be very easy for us to spare an action now and again to do our cadence call. Bear in mind that cadence call is not something that you can spam, you can only use it once per minute, but still, this is basically once per combat, and it's incredible. We also get our skill feat. Let's get more intimidation skill feats. As always, Terrified Retreat, it's a nice buff to our Demoralize ability. Every combat we get a free Demoralize action, so this skill is surely going to come in handy. At level 15, we get another skill increase. This is where we start getting our legendary skill increases, and you know how this goes. We take Intimidation because we want Scared to Death. We also get our ability boosts. At this point, our strength is maxed out. For the purpose of our armor, we are never using strength to deal damage, so I'm going to stop investing into it. I'm going to take Constitution and Wisdom and Charisma. These are all ability we want to keep investing into. And this is a good moment to point out that while we are wearing heavy armor, we do not have access to the specialization effects of that armor. So our dexterity saving throws are abysmal. Let's try making them better. I'm sorry, reflex saving throws. 5th edition player here. We also get a general feat. I will take Fleet to be able to keep up with the rest of the marshals in the party. Finally, we get a 5th Doctrine, which increases our proficiency for spells to Master, like all other full spellcasters, and this is very nice. At level 16, we get a class feat, and here I chose Eternal Blessing. This is not necessarily a very powerful effect, but it is a permanent bless spell with a 15-foot radius, which is always active. And what bless does, it's to give a +1 status bonus to attack rolls, just like the martial stance, but it's always active and it doesn't require any actions to trigger. So this is another reason to take Dread Martial Stance instead of the alternative. If you have other sources of status bonuses to attack rolls, then this becomes yet less useful. At level 16, we also get an archetype feat, and I wish we could have gotten this sooner, but I just couldn't fit it. At level 14, where we unlock this. This is the Diverse Armor Expert. This brings our proficiency in heavy armor up to Expert. And for the skill feat, as anticipated, we got our legendary proficiency in Intimidation, so we can get Scared to Death. At level 17, we get another legendary skill proficiency, and for sure, this is going to be Medicine. We also get an Ancestry feat. There aren't any Ancestry feat which I particularly want, so once again I can use the human ability to mess with feats and take Advanced General Training for another general feat. And it's level 17, so this is the level where Canny Acumen becomes active, giving us Master Proficiency in something of our choice. We could use this to improve our abysmal reflex saving throws. However, instead I'm going to invest this into Perception. Our Perception proficiency is not very good. This brings it up to Master, and combined with our high Wisdom is going to ensure that we get to act sooner in combat. Maybe we can dodge out of the way and avoid some AoE effects. This seems more useful than just reflex proficiency. Reflex is bad. Our reflex saving throws are terrible, and I don't think there is much we can do about it at this point. At level 18, we get a very nice class feat in Domain Wellspring. This allows us to regain our full 3 focus points when we refocus. So we can really spam focus spells as much as we want. We've got a bunch of Lay on Hands. We can also do our Aura of Light. I will also get Champion Resiliency. This is going to give us 3 additional hit points for each champion archetype class feat we chose. This is going to significantly increase our survivability. We took a bunch of champion feats. Now, the free archetype rule specifically says that you shouldn't be able to gain double hit points from this kind of feat. So if there is a level, like level 4 here, we took a champion feat with both our feats. This is an exploit we could use at every level to gain a lot of HP and become very hard to kill. So the rules specifically state that when this occurs, you only get the HP increase once. I don't know if this applies in cases where you don't get any champion feat at the other levels. So maybe at level 6, where we took no champion level, then at this level, the +3 HP for basic devotion would apply. This seems a very generous interpretation of the rule. Already the free archetype rule is very generous from the Dungeon Master, so I wouldn't be upset if the DM said, no, you only get +3 HP at level 4. Still, even with this restriction, extra HP are always nice. We get our second legendary skill feat, and this is Legendary Medic. This makes us able to use medicine to basically remove any condition. At level 19, it's time for our last legendary skill increase, that's Diplomacy. We also get a general skill feat. At this point, as always, I kind of ran out of good general feats. And so I take Incredible Investiture because we are at high level, we have the Charisma, and we probably have magic items to invest. We get our final Doctrine. We are very happy to be Cloistered Clerics right now because we get legendary attack rolls and spell disease for the divine spells. We also get miraculous spells, which means we get our 10th level spells. And finally, our character career concludes at level 20. We are going to finish increasing our wisdom, bringing it to 22, the maximum. Again, we increase our dexterity a little bit, bringing it to 14. Not the worst possible outcome, but many clerics are going to want to start with this 14 dexterity instead of just, getting it at level 20 when the game is over. And you have probably risked dying, if not outright, died a bunch of times because you were too slow to avoid fireballs or your armor class was too low. We're also going to take our charisma up to 20 with a +5 bonus to charisma, which means we get 5 extra bonus spells from our healing font, and these are 10th level spells. And finally, our last ability increase doesn't matter. We can only put it to intelligence where it does something, giving us an extra skill proficiency. And as always, we take performance because it's a nice retirement plan to become entertainers. Our capstone class feat is Maker of Miracles. With any other class, this would double our 10th level spell slots. With the cleric, we already have 5 10th level spell slots from our healing font, +1 from our class. Now we get 2 from our class, so 10th level spells extravaganza. Then we get our free archetype. I will take a champion feat just to take advantage of the extra HP, but really you can take anything here. In particular, the feat I'm going to take is Deity's Domain to get a domain spell, and we're going to take the Fire Domain focus spell. This is a nice attack focus spell, which deals reasonable amount of damage and requires a spell attack roll, which we're pretty good at. We could have tried and squeezed it in other parts of the build. You can rearrange a bit the feats if you like this attack focus spell and want to start with it, and you feel it's more fun for you to use than Dazzling Flash. If you don't care about positive luminance, you can take Fire Ray with another domain spell instead of taking positive luminance. And finally, we get our last legendary skill feat, which is Legendary Negotiation. We don't need the skill very much, but it's nice to conclude the build with it. All right, we ended up with a pretty powerful support character that can give extra actions to the class. And while it is true that this is the merit of the martial archetype, which is incredibly powerful, this was also made possible by the cleric framework because of the flexibility and the freedom that cleric class feats offer you. The most important cleric abilities are in the class framework itself. The class gives you all you need to be a good cleric, and so you can use your feats to do anything you want. Even in a game without free archetypes, we saw at various points in the build that we could have just committed to the martial archetype and not suffer as clerics too much for it. We also saw how much the cleric asks and how often the cleric asks you to make tough decisions, and how often you find yourself having to compromise and sacrifice either survivability or the ability to cast spells as a true primary spellcaster. This build, however, is missing an important piece, which is the spellcasting, the element that we sacrificed our survivability and damage dealing potential for. So let's see how good it is in the spellcasting snapshot. Before starting to cover the spells of the cleric, it is important to note that the cleric is a prepared spellcaster as opposed to a spontaneous spellcaster like the Bard, which we covered 2 videos ago. The Cleric also uses an old school version of prepared spellcasting known as Vancian spellcasting. This is different from 5th edition prepared spellcasting, where your prepared spells and your spell slots are different. So your prepared spells are the spells you have readied for the day, and then you can expand your spell slots to cast these prepared spells. You can, for example, prepare Blessing as a level 1 spell, and then you can use all your level 1 spell slots to cast the Blessing, or you can also upcast the Blessing using your 2nd level spell slots. Vancian spellcasting does not work like that. In this system, your spell slots and your prepared spells coincide. So if you want to cast Blessing 3 times, then you have to allocate 3 slots to Blessing. If you want to upcast Blessing as a 2nd level spell, then you have to slot into that 2nd level spell slot the Blessing spell. This means that prepared spellcasters are way less flexible than spontaneous spellcasters. In particular, they run the risk of preparing a circumstantial spell, and then that circumstance never occurs, and that spell slot is never going to be used throughout the day, whereas a spontaneous spellcaster usually tries to learn something that, no matter what, they will always be able to use. So even if they learned a circumstantial spell, as long as they know another spell of the same level, which they can use basically all the times, like a damage-dealing spell, then they will always manage to use all their spell slots every day. Prepared spellcasting is not necessarily inferior to spontaneous spellcasting. In fact, in previous edition it was markedly better because of the versatility that prepared spellcasters had when compared to the spontaneous ones. In particular, in the case of the Cleric has access to its entire spell selection every time, and every day they can prepare it without any limitations, apart from the spell slots themselves. So for a prepared spellcaster, knowledge is power. If you know what you are going to face, you can tailor your prepared spell for that situation, and that is where you shine compared to spontaneous spellcasters, because they are never going to be as perfectly fitted as you can be if you know what you're facing. However, if you don't know what you're facing, that is where you might struggle more compared to a spontaneous spellcaster. So if you try to make a generic list, which is what we are trying to do here, we might feel like we are worse than spontaneous spellcasters because we might end up preparing the same spell in multiple slots and feel like our list is more limited than it actually is. But when you're playing a prepared spellcaster, you should really have different sets of spell lists for different occasions. Maybe you are in a social situation, or you are exploring, or you're fighting the final boss of the campaign. And in all these circumstances, your list should look quite different. This is of course very true for a class like the Wizard. The Cleric has a more limited spell list, so it's easier to do this, and it's something I think new players should really try to do. However, this is not something we are going to see in this spell snapshot. We are going to see the generic spell list, or what I think can be a generic spell list. So I am going in blind, I don't know what is going to happen, and so I'm going to try and take spells that I am pretty confident I can cast no matter what. So starting from the cantrips, let us not forget that we took adapted cantrip at level 1, so we can take a damage dealing cantrip. Everyone says electric arc is amazing. It's clear to see why. This is basically guaranteed damage, even on a successful reflex saving throw in an AoE. It's a pretty nice damaging cantrip. We are a divine spellcaster, so we have access to guidance. This is not as busted as it is in 5th edition, because once you target a creature with it, then this creature becomes immune to the spell for an hour, so you cannot quite spam it. But when you really need a status bonus to something, including attack rolls, you can give this with a 1-action cantrip. We are humans, we don't have dark visions, we can't see shit in the dark, so we should take light. Also, we are a spellcaster, so detect magic might come in handy. If other members of the parties have it, there is no need to have multiples of this cantrip, but somebody should have it. And at last, I always like to take message for some sneaky communication in social situations, can come in very handy. Our level 1 spell slots, I think, are going to both go to Magic Weapon. Very powerful combat buff at low levels. So I am pretty sure that I'm going to use both casts of these spells. We also must not forget that we are clerics, and so these are not the only spells we have. We also have access to the cleric font, which is healing. And because our charisma modifier is +2, we have 2 + 1 heal spells. So we have a grand total of 5 spells at level 1, as opposed to the 2 spells a regular spellcaster would get. And you might object in saying, well, 3 of these spells must be heals, but actually, even if we had the choice of any other spell in the divine spell list, I would argue that taking 3 heals would still be a pretty solid choice. Heck, you could cut these magic weapons. Maybe there are other spellcasters who can do this. Arcane spellcasters, the Bard could use it, or occult spellcasters can do this, and take more heals, and I'm pretty sure that's a very solid choice. So this is the true power of the cleric. This is going to be here throughout our progression. These spell slots from the cleric font are going to always be our highest spells, and we're going to get more of them as we increase our charisma. And it is so incredibly good, and it is basically the reason to play a cleric, I think. Our next snapshot is at level 6. At this point, Magic Weapon is no longer useful, so we should replace it. We also just got Cast Down, which means that we can use our first level spell slots for harm. This does not deal much damage, but it doesn't matter as long as it deals some damage, and if it does, this will cause an irresistible knockdown. This is excellent control. This takes away enemy actions. This can take away boss actions. You can cast it as a single action combined with cast down. This would be 2 actions to knock down an enemy, and then you can stride away from them instead of stepping to avoid opportunity attacks. It seems a very good use of first level spell slots, so without knowing what to do, I just picked a bunch of harms. You can also cast it as a 2-action spell and drop an enemy prone from a distance. At second level, I would like to be dealing a lot of damage at range, and I feel like a very iconic cleric spell is Spiritual Weapon. Since we are not using our strength to do weapon attacks, we can use our wisdom instead. This doesn't deal much damage, but it does deal the damage of a longsword, and it has our spell attack modifier, so it's decent enough. We're not going to rival with martials, but we're going to contribute. And if I prepare 3 versions of the spell, it's basically 3 combats where I know what to do. Every turn I will sustain and do a strike with a spiritual weapon. Then I can do a cantrip, so spiritual weapon, electric arc, for some pretty reasonable amount of damage. We've got a lot of options for combat. We can also raise a shield. Let us not forget that we have bought a shield at level 1, so if we feel like we need a little more armor class, we can always raise our shield. We also have 3rd level spells. I will get one version of Heroism. This lasts for 10 minutes, so you can potentially precast this, and it can last for more than 1 combat. It's a nice buff for martials. And then, since we are Clerics of Serenre, we can take a couple of fireballs. This is very reliable AoE damage. I feel like AoE damage is not something martials do very well, and they kind of rely more on spellcasters for this. And so, here they are, the fireballs. We also got an increase to our Charisma ability score. This means that we have a bunch of heal spells ready to go. So the reasoning behind my selection in this case is to be able to last as much as possible, to have spell slots that can allow me to go through multiple combats without needing to rest. So we have a couple of fireballs, which are kind of circumstantial. We need to have a lot of enemies, and we need to be facing multiple, perhaps low-level enemies, and we can make the encounter easier for this. We have Heroism to buff our frontliner, and in other fights where we are fighting like a boss or a bunch of few tough enemies, we can sustain our spiritual weapon and electric arc, and perhaps add in a bit of control through casts of harm combined with cast down. Let us now see how the character looks in 11 levels. I'm still going to keep low-level harms for the control aspect of things. We have a lot of high-level spell slots, so I think we can afford to use second-level spells for some circumstantial buffs. In particular, I think it would be nice to have Dark Vision, since we don't have it naturally. This is a spell we can cast only once on ourselves, or maybe somebody who needs it a bit more, and be able to see in the dark. Another nice circumstantial spell, since we go around in heavy armor, is Instant Armor. We can recast this as well. This lasts for the entire day, and then it allows us to wear our heavy armor using just one action. So we can rest, and if we get ambushed, we can immediately jump inside our armor and are not defenseless. I will use my third level slot to prepare a heightened harm. This would help overcome resistances. It deals a little bit more damage. But again, it's just extra ranged trips. At level 3, on the control side of things, I think a very powerful spell to heighten is Fear. This is targets up to 5 creature and inflicts the frightened condition very reliably. So I feel like I'm going to prepare 2 of these and almost always find a good spot where to use this. And as for the last level 3 spell, I chose a single target control spell, Roaring Applause. This is a sustained spell that, as long as it works, denies the use of reaction from an enemy, even if they succeed on their will saving throw. If they fail, it also applies the slowed condition, so it's very potent. I feel like this is another spell that we can be pretty sure we're going to find some good use in our adventuring day. At level 4, we have a very powerful effect in Airwalk. This is kind of like Fly. In those circumstances where you need mobility, Airwalk seems very convenient to have. I will also use level 4 spell slots for more heightened spells, because some of these spells gain extra powerful effects. One of them is Silence. When heightened at 4th level, Silence becomes an emanation which prevents noise from taking effect. This means that spells with verbal components cannot be cast in the area of Silence. When Silence is just a 2nd level spell, it just makes the creature you cast it on noiseless. So it helps with infiltration, but it's not nearly as powerful as it is now. You can cast this on a barbarian who doesn't care about not being able to make noise. Well, they might be a bit offended because they do like screaming a lot. But being able to really hinder the spellcasting of enemies seems like a very powerful effect. And lastly, at level 4, another spell that heightens very well is Spiritual Weapon. This gains an extra d8 for damage. So this again can be our spammable sustained spell to deal damage every round in combat encounters where we don't have anything better to do. At level 5, clerics get a wall spell, and this is very exciting. It's called Wall of Flesh, and it really doesn't look like the kind of spell a cleric of Serenre would have. At least I thought this at first, but then I realized it could be made of like worshippers, handsome bodies entwined, very disturbing, very dark fantasy. So it doesn't have the evil trait, it does have the necromancy trait, but it's certainly a very impressive spell to cast on the battlefield, and it is a wall with extra effects, so it's a potent control effect to have access to. Very cool to see in action and certainly very useful, so I took that. I also did not forget about fireballs. I just prepare them at higher levels so they can deal, their damage can scale. I think being able to deal AoE damage, it's very important for this character, and Fireball is a spell that is going to accompany us throughout our career because it can help solve problems like we are surrounded or we are in a small room which is rapidly filling with flammable gas. Level 6 is also the level where heroism scales from a +1 to a +2 status bonus to a bunch of things, including attack rolls. Again, same as before, but better, so we are going to take it. I took only one copy because I expect there to be generally one character who can benefit from this. If you have multiple marshals, that can benefit from this, you shouldn't have favorites and you should have multiple copies of Heroism, one for each. If not, then this is an even level of spells, which means that Spiritual Weapon scales. So being able to deal 3d8 with your attack action can be pretty powerful. Is it worth a level 6 spell slot? Heroism is certainly better, but maybe you don't need multiple copies of it. I'm not sure. Maybe this is a bit of a waste, but it's a reliable and safe damage dealing option, so why not take it? Let us move on now to level 16. My low-level spells haven't changed much. The only thing that I changed is I took away Fear at level 3, because I feel like I have better control effects at higher level. So instead I just prepared more harm spells. Also at level 4 I feel that this spiritual weapon is no longer dealing reasonable amounts of damage. So instead I took another heightened spell, Circle of Protection. This lasts for an hour and gives an AoE bonus to the armor class and also a bonus from effects that control the target and attacks made by summoned creatures of the chosen alignment, which is usually going to be evil. This stacks very nicely with the other effects from the martial class that we now have access to. So it's another of those spells that we cast at the start of the day or at the beginning of our dungeoneering, and it's probably going to last long enough throughout multiple combats. I also feel like Fireball at level 5, once we're level 16, doesn't deal enough damage, so instead I took another copy of Wall of Flesh. And maybe 3 Wall of Flesh is a bit too much, so I took a reaction spell. We do have plenty of reactions, but Drop Dead is an additional effect that we can use to save a creature from very nasty effects. This reaction triggers when a creature within range is hit by an attack from an enemy, and we can make it look as if the creature falls down dead, although they are actually invisible. So our ally becomes invisible and the spell creates an illusion that looks like a dead body. This complements our healing very nice. Perhaps an ally is getting low and we can make them invisible and then heal them. Keep in mind that if an ally is invisible, not only the enemy has trouble targeting them, but we have trouble targeting them too. We might fail our spellcast if we don't know where they are. So take care when making your allies invisible. They become harder to target for you as well. Heroism is still relevant, so I kept it. And I took a second copy of Spiritual Weapon. Again, we have access up to 8 level spell slots. So using 6 level spell slots for reliable damage doesn't feel too bad anymore. Level 7 is the level I dedicated to AoE spells. The Cleric in the Divine Spell list has a very nice AoE effect, which is Sunburst. This deals 8d10 fire damage and an additional 8d10 damage against undead creatures. We can compare this spell to a Heightened Fireball, which deals 14d6. So the Heightened Fireball is better unless you're facing undead, in which case Sunburst is way better. The area of Sunburst is also way larger, so there's also this thing to consider. So I will take 1 copy of Sunburst just because of the wider area of effect, but I think Fireball is more reliable, so I will take 2 copies of it. Again, if you know you're going to explore a cemetery or a place where you expect a lot of undead, I wouldn't expect to prepare a single Fireball, instead I would just prepare Sunbursts. We get to level 8, there is a very impressively named spell, which is called Divine Armageddon. This is again an AoE damage effect. This does not deal fire damage, so maybe we're facing fire-resistant enemies. This is 20d6, chosen amongst the alignment of our deity. Hopefully we're fighting evil creatures, so this applies. And this is better than Fireball as long as we can trigger our aligned damage. It is clear how restricted the Divine Spell list is. Look how few spells we have at this level. It doesn't feel too bad to heighten lower level spells. And in particular, again, I'm insisting on the Spiritual Weapon. Now the Spiritual Weapon deals 4d8 damage. We are striking with a plus 26 to hit. It is not that bad. It is a very reasonable contribution to damage. We are kind of doing what a War Cleric would do with their weapon, only we are probably doing it better because we can hit more reliably thanks to our enhanced spell proficiency. And we are not very much in danger because this weapon can go wherever it wants, and we can be far away while our weapon is next to the enemy and delivers the damage. And finally, to conclude, let us look at our level 20 spell list. How does it look like? First thing we notice, and we're very happy about it, is this L in our spellcasting proficiency. It means we are legendary, and this is what we wanted from the beginning of the build. The lower levels, once again, I haven't changed much. It's mostly circumstantial spells that we can still use at this high levels. At level 6, though, once again, Spiritual Weapon is no longer dealing reasonable amounts of damage. And Heroism, we have the better version right now, so there's no point in taking the lower version. So we can use level 6 for things like Spirit Blast. It's still 16d6 damage, even not upcast. We can get more reactions, like Scintillating Safeguard, which gives resistance to the entirety of the party against a damaging effect. This can be nice. We can prevent a bit of damage, keep people alive, and then heal them back up. It looks like it matches very well what we're trying to do with the character, so I'll take 2 copies of this. At level 7, I kept the Fireballs and the Sunburst. I feel we can still expect to be fighting low-level enemies where these would be effective. I also kept Divine Armageddon and double Spiritual Weapon. At this point, level 8 Spiritual Weapons are no longer a hard sell, but they are something we can do pretty nicely because we've got a lot of higher level spell slots. We get our level 9 spells, and one of them is for sure going to be Heightened Heroism. This is a +3 status bonus to attacks and other things, including saving throws and skill checks. If you have 3 characters that can make use of this, I would prepare this 3 times without hesitation. If you don't, there are other options. A very nice long duration buff is Foresight. This gives you another reaction. It might be better to cast this on a creature which is not you. We have really a lot of reactions. Maybe we can cast this on another spellcaster. And finally, the Crusade spell. This is a mental effect, a control effect, where you can target up to 4 creatures and give them a cause, and they will follow this cause. It's like 5th edition Mass Suggestions on less creatures and on steroids, as long as you give them a clever cause. And the most impressive thing about the spell is that if it targets enemies of 14th level or lower, this does not allow saving throws. Of course, it does end for enemies of 14th level if they get below half their maximum hit points, but for 13th level or lower, it just never ends. So just turn your main antagonist minions against them. And we also get our 10th level spell slots, and we have Wish equivalent, which is Miracle, so we're going to take it, and we're going to take it twice. Let us not forget about this absolutely bonkers levels of healing we have access to, with 6 10th level heals, which heal 10d8 hit points if cast with a single action, or they can heal 10d8 plus 80 if cast as a 2 action. If you're fighting undead, you can use the 3 action cast to not only heal your entire party, but also damage the enemies. The price for this is you'll have to renounce the 80 extra healing. So when we look at this spell list, it is a lot less impactful than the occult list we had for the Bard. There are a lot of gaps in this spell list. The selection of spells offered were not as impactful and versatile as the Bard's. This character, I specialized him into a kind of blasting role with a little bit of support and control, relying on the fact that their most powerful asset would be the ability to keep the party healed. This is accomplished not just through the Cleric font, but also through the focus spells, of which we have plenty thanks to our abundant focus points, which we can use for Lay on Hands or also Positive Luminance. Lay on Hands is obviously the better option of the two. And thanks to also our skill, our proficiency in medicine, which allows us access to healing through non-magical means and resource-free means. So, while this is maybe not the flashiest and most powerful and exciting spell list, it looks very solid and very satisfactory to play. In particular, I had a heavy reliance on spiritual weapons because I didn't want to feel completely useless damage-wise when compared to a war cleric, and I wanted to also kind of use my actions to attack from time to time, and my spell list allowed me to do that. So with that being said, I think we can move on to the final thoughts for the build. For the final thoughts, let us remember that our goal was to try and see how long does it take to a cloistered cleric to catch up to a war cleric. So the first level was absolutely miserable because I sacrificed dexterity, which we really could have used for our defenses, and constitution in order to get the strength we needed for the champion archetype and the charisma that we wanted for our cleric font slots. So level 1 was extremely vulnerable and miserable, but not completely useless thanks to our adapted cantrip and the possibility to cast Electric Arc and maybe do a bit of demoralizing or just raising our shield or just keep out of trouble in general. Immediately at level 2, we gained the first increase to our survivability by gaining access to medium armor and being able to wear it. And then level 3, this can be further upgraded to heavy armor. Level 3 is also where we get our first cast of Spiritual Weapon, and we can use this to emulate in some combats what the War Cleric does of doing strikes without being in as much danger as the War Cleric. We also get access to very good healing capabilities, which just keep getting better. At level 4, the Champion Archetype gives us even more with Lay on Hands and Extra Focus Spell. And then at level 6, we finally get our Martial Dedication. It's still not kicking on, it's still not doing much for us, but we get a bit of control through Cast Down. And then at level 8, we get to buff our allies in an AoE. So we all of a sudden want to get closer. We get Cadence Call, being able to buff the entire party. We increase our survivability continuously until at level 14, we reach the peak of our support capabilities with Tactical Cadence. So this has been a very smooth curve with a harsh start, but I think a very powerful conclusion. We could, of course, have neglected the champion archetype. We could have gained heavy armor proficiency from somewhere else and focused more on our dexterity. Perhaps that would have been more optimal. However, I really like the champion because it eventually gives us an incredibly powerful reaction, as well as Lay on Hands, which complements so much and so well our healing. In a single turn, we can do a heal and a Lay on Hands for 3 action, the heal for 2 action and the Lay on Hands for 1, as long as we are in contact with the enemy. And positioning is key with this build, but it's made easier by the use of Cadence Call. And if we can do this 3-action heal, so 2-action heal plus Lay on Hands, we can restore ridiculous amounts of health to a character. So while I don't think that this build is optimal in any way, I think it highlights very well what I was saying about the cleric, about the need to make choices and about how much you can end up losing while making these choices. I still think that the more optimal way would be to start as a war cleric and eventually retrain out of it. That would be very safe. You would start at low level, being able to swing a weapon and strike and still be just as good as a cloistered cleric with your spells and your heals. And when that no longer becomes useful, you just retrain out of it and become a cloth spellcaster. In general, the cleric seems like a class that can play very well into its most thematic roles of a supporter and a healer, while also sprinkling in some martial proficiencies. It always does an excellent job at keeping these things in check and never allowing you to outshine the specialists in their role. As always, enhancing the abilities of your team seems more effective and rewarding than just focusing on doing your own things and trying to be better than everyone else. With that being said, let me know about your clerics and the way you develop them. Let me know if I missed something important that allows you to actually get everything you want as a cleric without sacrificing anything. We ended up having weak reflex saving throws and low dexterity with this build. Maybe there was a way to get that as well, or have a smoother progression. Or maybe focusing more on class feats to enhance your healing capabilities was actually the right choice. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I thank you all very much for listening, and I'll see you all in the next one.